Hi everyone, so this is Denis Boudreau. I'm going to quickly get us started by introducing my colleague here. Aparna will introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us on this session. I'm Aparna Pasi, Accessibility Team Lead with DQ Systems for the last 2 years and with 12 years experience in accessibility and usability. On to you, Denny.
Thank you. And I'm Denis, as I said, Principal Consultant and Training Lead for DQ Systems. Um, Involved in a lot of different things at DQ, most of them being having to do with training and consulting in general. Um, and we have something in chat, Aparna, about you needing to speak a little.
Yes.
Okay, cool. So involved in training in general, and also with a lot of things related to design and accessibility here at DQ. So I thought that a way for us to get started with this today and also connect with what we've been doing already in this series, because we've had two webinars already in the UX series, one on personas, one on the heuristics themselves. We've already introduced those heuristics in the prior webinar, which you can have access to if you haven't seen it yet. And what we wanted to do as a follow-up to that was to look into how we can use those heuristics to help designers get more involved in the process for accessibility and help them get a very clear understanding of what they can do and how they can contribute to the success of a project and ultimately help make the experience for users that much more accessible in general. And the first thing that I wanted to bring in for that particular aspect of what we're going to be talking about today is the fact that accessibility is really something that needs to be owned by pretty much everyone on your team. So, and this is a concept that has been floating around for a couple of years now. It used to be that people would think that accessibility was just one of those things that QA people would do. We've learned through the years that the earlier you would start thinking about accessibility, the more likely you were to succeed in meeting that goal in your project. So everyone has a role to play. The reason why that is because accessibility really is a hard topic to master. I know that we like to pretend that accessibility as such is pretty straightforward and easy if you know what you're doing, but getting to know what you're supposed to be doing is the hard part because there's so much that you need to think about that very quickly you can feel overwhelmed as a designer. I mean, as any stakeholder in the project, you might feel that way. But as a designer, that's one of those things that we often hear about is that people want to do this, they want to help, they want to make the experience better for their users, but it's hard for them to wrap their head around what it is that they're supposed to be doing. So one of the ways in which we've learned to master this or to approach it in a more successful way is this idea of integrating accessibility much earlier on in the process that we normally were doing before. So this is what something we call shifting left at DQ. Basically, the idea of moving further left on the project in the project lifecycle to start integrating ideas for accessibility as early as the very early design phases. So looking into usability principles, understanding the users that we're working with, what their realities might be, particularities that they may have, challenges they may have, and so on and so forth. And then working with the entire team to make sure that people understand what the expectations are throughout the project, but also from the very early phases, like I said. And when it comes to a process, this is a representation of what we may mean. So what you have on the screen basically is a bit of a diagram about a life cycle where we see key phases like the wireframe phase, the product backlog, the sprint backlog, the sprint itself, the point where you get to a shippable product, and then system being deployed. And the whole thing is really sort of linked together through dashed lines to sort of illustrate how the process works. And what we try to do as much as possible with our clients is to integrate accessibility at key aspects of each of those areas. So today we're obviously focused on everything related to design and UX. So what that means in terms of a life cycle, in terms of a representation of a life cycle, is that whether we're at the design phase, we're at the wireframe specific phase, we're looking at mockups, we're looking at research, whatever it is that we're doing at that particular phase, we want to make sure that accessibility is baked in at that moment. And for a lot of people, this idea of what you're supposed to do as a designer is often a little blurry. People don't really understand what it is they're supposed to do beyond paying attention to color contrast. And I like to think that as designers, our role really is much bigger than choosing nice colors and making things look pretty. Um, a lot of designers will agree that the main thing that they do is solve problems, which is something that I definitely agree with. When it comes to accessibility, I think the designer's role is very capital in the sense that it lays the foundations to help avoid a bunch of other issues that could otherwise happen further down the road. So preventing those issues from happening in the first place is what a designer's power is really, when he or she knows what to look for when trying to get the project started and define the requirements or the ground principles that are going to upon which we're going to build the entire project. And one of the reasons why that is, of course, is because when you think about issues in terms of accessibility, we've learned over the years that the earlier you find about those issues, the less costly and the less complicated they will be to fix. So what we have on the screen right now is a diagram, with an x and y axis. On the can never remember, on the y-axis, I think it is, you have a ratio going from 1 to 10 times to 100 times to 1,000 times to 10,000 times, and on the x-axis you have the conception phase, the design phase, the development phase, the testing phase, and the release phase. So your process, so to speak. And there's a representation of a bug or an issue, and it gets bigger and bigger the further you get in that process. So an issue that you may introduce at the conception phase, say something about a color contrast issue in your brand colors, for instance, that would be very easy to fix at the conception phase because you're already doing that at that moment, and nothing has been defined yet based on that choice. So that might be a ratio of 1 times the cost of the actual fix. But if you find that issue at the very end while you're about to release, maybe that particular issue with that color contrast on your brand colors might be 10,000 times as expensive to fix or complicated to fix, because at that point, there's so much that has been built on that particular color choice that it may be very difficult for you to get that addressed. And accessibility issues in general are very much like that. Whichever issue you find, we're going to find that the scale may vary, but it's always very similar to that ratio, where it gets harder and more complicated the more time it takes before you find it. And examples of that would be things like thinking about alt text for images, or having meaningful error messages on forms, or maybe even providing visible focus indicator when you're navigating with the keyboard. These questions are usually questions that we would address. Depending on your team and your process, of course. But those would generally be addressed somewhere further down the process. It may be that your content creator will look into alt text after you've chosen images, but you're not really involved in the process of defining that alt text. Or it may be that you develop a form as a designer, but then the developer will figure out all the error messages that needs to come up, and they'll do that again with the content creator because that's the person who creates the copy. And then maybe focus indicators are not being handled initially, and then someone at the development phase will try to patch that up by assigning a bit of an outline or something on the keyboard interactions. And all of those things get more complicated at that point because we don't really know what was intended initially, and these things may not have been addressed by the designer first. And if they had been addressed by the designer, or if the designer had been informed of what those things were, then the process could have been much smoother, and everybody would have understood or known what to do exactly further down the line. So this idea of going as early as possible in the process is something that we think is very valuable. But in order to do that, a designer needs to know what to look for. What we've done so far with the webinar series is look into a couple of things. Like I said, we started with the personas, and then we went to the heuristics. Basically, what we've done so far, as part of that 4-step process that we like to apply to what we're doing, is we covered the create, explore, and review pieces with the previous webinars where we've looked into the personas, we've created modular layers or lenses on top of those personas to integrate the idea of a particularity, like a cognitive disability or a visual impairment or something like that. We've looked at how those layers can affect or the meaning they can have on the experience of that persona using the product. And then we've reviewed how we can use the heuristics to try and address issues or potential issues in the work that we're doing. So now, as of this webinar today, we're looking into that fourth part of the process, which is really checking the work against the heuristics themselves to be able to do an accessibility review of the work that has been done. And the first three parts, like I said, are really about the review phase, and then the next part is really about the heuristics evaluation phase per se. So, so on the last session that we had, we talked about how we were using the wireframes that were created when we started working on our redesign at DQ.com. So that's what we're going to be showing you today, like going further into that direction, showing you some of those heuristics. We're going to cover 3 today, and basically using like the before and after versions of what that meant in terms of our process. So basically like showing you what happened behind the scenes with everything about that. And the reason why it matters is because we really feel that as designers, you're actually a big deal when it comes to accessibility. And it's time we recognize the impact and the value that designers bring to this goal of making content more accessible to people. So whether it's about how accessible content can be for people, or it's about how efficient the process can be internally because designers can plan ahead and avoid issues from even happening or prevent issues from happening in the first place. There's a lot that designers can do to help with that. So having said all that, we're going to jump into those heuristics. Like I said, we have a total of 10 that we'll be covering over this session and the next 2 sessions. We're going to cover 3 of them today. So navigation and wayfinding, structure and semantics, and then contrast and legibility. And we're going to move into that part as and I mean Aparna is going to move us into that part in a second. Before we do that, I just wanted to contextualize again something that we've said on the previous session, just so you have an understanding of what we're doing if you haven't been part of the previous sessions. So basically, the heuristics evaluation process itself is this idea that you're testing or you're evaluating a mock-up or a wireframe, the work you're doing, usually for usability, because it comes that's where it comes from work, previous work by Nielsen in 1990 up to 1995. And that to us has evolved into a different set of heuristics for accessibility. But basically, the idea is that you have a certain number of designers who are going to conduct an evaluation of a particular product according to a set of general rules of thumb, the heuristics themselves. So basically, defining who will be testing, how they will be testing is the first part. That's what we're going to be looking into. Understanding your users. So to us, that's using those personas with different lenses on them to see what the issues might be when it comes to a different type of disability, and then running through walking through the heuristics evaluation itself, and then collecting and analyzing the results in order to be able to go back to your work and improve based on the findings that you've uncovered through that process. So with that said, I'm going to move everything over to Aparna so she can talk to us about navigation and wayfinding as our first heuristic.
Thank you, Denis. Thank you for setting the context. Before moving on, am I audible to everyone now? I assume it to be yes. Okay. So every user experience consultant these days tend to perform heuristic evaluation of their product or screen to gain greater user experience. When we at DQ receive a wireframe for heuristic evaluation, we do it specifically for accessibility as we specialize in it. But to help ourselves perform this heuristic evaluation, we came up with 10 heuristic principles for accessibility. And as Denis mentioned earlier, we shall take you through first 3 principles and the way we analyze them against a wireframe to understand if the accessibility principles are met, and if so, then how well have we achieved that? So the first heuristic that we will go through is navigation and wayfinding, which checks if users can easily navigate and find content along with determining where the user is located in the website. Since we will not be able to demonstrate every heuristic on the wireframe, we will take you through each statement at a high level and then demonstrate 2 heuristic evaluations on the wireframe. So if you see the screen, we have certain statements that against which we have a measure, whether it is applicable. If it is, then it is yes. If it is not, then no. And sometimes we don't find scenarios where these heuristic statements apply and they would become not applicable. We also have a column stating rating, which would give the evaluator how well we have achieved that particular statement. So, for example, when we see a wireframe with interactive elements, our initial question should be on how the interactive elements focus state would be displayed to users. And that is nothing but the visual focus indicators. Targeted audience would be keyboard-only users, low vision users, and any power user who will need to understand and follow the focus order of the elements. Without a visible focus indicator, it would be nearly impossible for users to understand where the focus is present. In a couple of minutes, we shall see the difference between having a focus indicator and not having one. So the next heuristic statement talks about the title of the page, which is the very first element that a screen reader user would interact with. And as a designer, we may need to work with the content team to provide a meaningful title that would describe the purpose of the page. For example, About Us followed by DQ Systems would let the screen reader users know that the current page is About Us of DQ Systems, and having only DQ Systems wouldn't provide the context of the page, which is very essential from the screen reader perspective. The following statement would be about the first level heading present on the page, which should be ideally similar to the title so that it is ensuring or assuring the screen reader user that they are still on the same page. The following heuristic statement is about the heading sections. So having heading sections would provide a lot of context to the screen reader user, as well as any user to be able to judge the need to go through the content or skip through to the next section. We shall again look at the examples for the same in a couple of minutes. Many times, screen reader users tend to navigate through the web page using links or buttons or headings. That is the way they navigate. At the same time, there are many instances where we see read more and learn more links. So the fifth statement or the fifth heuristic statement is talking about that. As sighted users, we tend to get the context of learn more or read more links. But from a screen reader perspective, when they hear a group of hear more or learn more links, it doesn't really make sense to them. So again, as a designer, we need to work with the content team to ensure that we are giving the link text which conveys the purpose or the context of the link from the text itself. The last 2 would be about avoiding repetitive tabbing for screen reader users as well as the keyboard-only users. So when we provide a skip link at the beginning of the navigational section, and when you're making it visible, you're enabling the user to skip through the repetitive blocks. And also, the organization of the navigational elements helps the users to find their way within the website. Now, we shall look at the examples, the 2 examples that we have for this particular heuristic, and that would be the visible focus indicator. So if you see onto the screen, the left side is our wireframe image, where they are interactive elements, but the focus state is not clearly shown. So when we were going through these wireframes, we made sure that we have that particular state. As a result, this is the result is on the right side of the slide with the image where training has a 2-pixel underline showing that that is the particular element in focus. So the statement that we need to ask ourselves here is there a clear visible indicator set on all actionable elements as they receive focus? And how well have we achieved it? Even having browser default, the dotted lines will achieve it, but are we giving that great user experience to the user should be the question. And the next slide would be about the heading, the meaningful section headings itself. So again, if you look at the image onto the left, we have about us, which is defining the section. And then we have 4 sectional elements. But I, as a user, I'm not sure if these are the services that are being offered by the company, or are they saying that these are what we do? I'm not sure because there's no section heading for it. So the context of those links or elements is unclear. Whereas if you see onto the right, we know that the page is about the workspace attest. And then we also know that there are few of our of the trafficked websites that are trusted by workspace attest. And then we also know that there are problems that the workspace attest solve. So we know that each section has a subheading, which is giving the context of the section itself. So now we would move on to the second heuristic. Denis, on to you.
Thank you. Okay, so there were a couple of questions in chat that I could see, and I answered some of them as we were going. So for the benefit of everyone, I will sort of weave that in what I'm about to say. First of all, yes, the slides will be shared after the session. I think it's just a regular follow-up to the webinar with access to the slides themselves. So you will get access to those. So don't exert don't try to write down everything. You will have that. That's what I'm trying to say. And the other question was about the table that we showed initially. So I'm about to get to that, and I will answer those questions too. So the second heuristic basically is about structure and semantics. So it's really about the idea that users can make sense of the structure of the content on each of the pages, and also understand how to operate within the system, within the site, the application, the product itself. So how to basically leverage that structure and the semantics underneath the structure to understand what is going on and how to use the content. So we have a list again of 7 different statements that are basically the granular breakdown of that heuristic. So a bunch of different ways through which we can wrap our head around what that heuristic actually means, because that's the whole point. The whole point here is to say, as a designer, you should be looking into those 10 heuristics as the tools that you're working with. But when you start working with one of those tools and you want to be very precise about what it is that you're looking for, then that breakdown gives you that information. And as we go through these other sessions, we'll keep adding other tables for each of those heuristics. So ultimately, you will get yourself a nice full list of all the things that we think are most relevant when it comes to design. So there was a question about the measure versus rating and the star and the check mark versus the yes. I'm going to get through that really quickly. The measure part actually is something that we're adding for accessibility that you usually would not find in a heuristic evaluation. In a heuristic evaluation, you would have questions such as those, and you would have the rating part, and it would basically be, have I addressed that particular situation? And the answer would be either check mark or X for yes or no. But you also have that star for situations where you really go beyond and you provide a fantastic user experience when it comes to that thing. So depending on how you want to work through this, in terms of the heuristics themselves, it's really about hitting at least check marks everywhere, and whenever you can, hitting stars instead. Because the more stars you have, theoretically, the more satisfactory the experience would be ultimately. The measure part is something that we're adding just because of accessibility, and because one of the concerns that people have when they come to us is that they want to make sure that they comply with a particular set of guidelines. In most cases, WCAG 2.0 or WCAG 2.1. So we use both systems in parallel. There is the user experience piece that comes in the rating, and then there's a measure that basically tells you that particular element, is that something, because every one of those things refers ultimately to a success criterion in WCAG. So for each of those things, is the measure a yes as it complies, or a no as it fails, or is it just not applicable because in the context we either don't have that thing or it's not relevant to what we're doing. So those are two different indications of measures that we have to see whether or not the design itself meets our goals for accessibility. Some of the heuristic statements that we had in here are whether or not the content that looks like heading is defined as such in the wireframe. So it's one thing to have content that is big and bold, but if the designers don't convey that this is supposed to be a heading, maybe it doesn't end up being marked up as a heading further down the process. Same thing for skipping hierarchic levels in the headings themselves. If the designers don't mention that a particular heading structure is in place, the heading levels might differ when it comes to the development. So defining those things ahead of time, again, saves some pain and problems further down the process. Paying attention to whether or not the information is conveyed only through sensory characteristics. So for instance, referring to something by its color or its location on the screen or its shape. Instead of doing that, making sure that we're also supporting that information by a piece of text. So maybe there's a red button, but that red button probably has text in it. So defining the red button with some such label will allow someone who can't see the color or can't perceive the visual perspective of it, at least find it through its text asset. So supporting everything with text is basically what it comes down to. When it comes to navigation mechanisms, like menus, navigation menus, menu bars, groups, like an enumeration of links, in the content, structuring every one of those things with actual lists and defining that again through our annotations in the wireframe would help the developers know exactly what is expected in terms of that content. Data tables, same thing. Making sure that we have table headers or column headers or table header rows that I always get those mixed up. Column header rows and you know what I mean, TH on the column headers is what I'm trying to say. So we have those defined both visually in the design itself, which would be expected, but also have annotations that define that those things are not just regular data cells, but they're actually header cells. If we have groupings of form elements, making sure that there's a common label that works for the entire grouping, whether it's for a phone number or if we're asking for gender, for instance, having that label on top of everything else will sort of group or create grouping for the whole thing. We want to have that visually, but we also want to have that conveyed programmatically to screen reader users. So defining that through the annotations would also be something that the designer could provide as part of the documentation. And then finally, when it comes to form controls, text fields, checkboxes, and all these different things, that they do have a visible, meaningful text label, and I insist on visible because we want to make sure that that label stays visible all the time, that it's persistent, which means that using placeholder text values, for instance, might be an issue because if you're using those and I start typing in, then the label disappears and all I have is the actual data. So figuring out a way where the labels either remain visible or that they're that they just stay there, or that they at least they get replaced by something if they disappear through a placeholder text. And the first example that I wanted to cover with that was this idea that form controls have a visible, meaningful text label, and also the groupings. So as an example, on the left-hand side of the screen right now, we have a very early version of our wireframes where we were looking into a form for a section called Get Accessibility Help. So we have in there a couple of regular text fields like first name, last name, email, and so on. But we have this section called Help Needed, which is one label. And underneath that, we have 6 different checkboxes, which all have their own individual labels. So each of the checkboxes, whether they say training and education, accessibility strategy, accessibility fixes, identifying accessibility issues, selection of accessibility tools, or other, all those things have their own little label for each of the checkboxes, so they could programmatically be associated, and everything would be great. But they all refer to something much bigger than just them, and that's the idea that this is a section called help needed. So for something like this, we could define help needed as a common label for the entire thing. But if the designer doesn't define that through the requirements of the document that he or she provides, then that may become a heading, or it may become just like regular text that the developer puts in a div, and it's completely disconnected from the rest of the content. So defining these things and thinking about conveying that information through the annotations will again inform the design and inform the process going further. And then when it comes to the visual, the visual labels, for instance, if you look on the right-hand side, it's a very crude mock-up of a form wireframe where we can see that, and we don't see text or anything. It's just like gray areas that are supposed to represent labels, and then just white boxes for the forms themselves. But we can see that the first three boxes, first text fields, have their own little label next to them, but then there's a big text area at the bottom that doesn't have such a label. In other words, if something like that was to be developed by a developer, then that text area would not have its own visible label. So it may become an issue in that sense for some users if it doesn't have its own label assigned to it. So again, it allows the designer to think about those things and to announce what is expected so that the developers don't create issues on their own based on a lack of information from the design. Another example would be the content that looks like heading not being defined as such, or the heading structure skipping hierarchic levels. So again, on the right-hand side, now we have the wireframe, the initial wireframe of what the footer of the DQ.com page should be. So basic gray text with gray backgrounds and zones defined. It ultimately ended up being very similar on the actual implementation and production of the site. But when we initially received the wireframes from our agency, they had defined some of these pieces of text as looking like headings, but there wasn't any information about if they were headings, if they were meant to be headings or not. Like for instance, we have a section or column for about, one for tools, one for services, one for training, one for learning accessibility, and one for result in the wireframe, and they all have a series of links underneath. So if you don't define anything like that, it would not be surprising if a developer ended up saying, so we have a bunch of lists, and the first element in that list will be about, and the other ones will be linked, as opposed to saying, I'm actually going to create a list for the links themselves, and I'm going to have a heading on top of it. So the first part you want to convey as a designer is that those are actually meant to be headings, and they're not part of that list. And the second part that you need to think about is also, what's the hierarchic level of those headings? So if I have a section, a general section that is called, say, need accessibility help, for instance, and across the entire design, we identify that as being a H2 because it sits on that level hierarchically, then the content for about, tools, services, training, learning, accessibility, and results here can't be H3s because visually it implies that they're different things. And if we had about as a H3, it would then become a child hierarchy, like structurally speaking, would become a child of need accessibility help, which was our H2. So defining something like this would mean that we have to think about distributing our heading structure in a way that the footer section, the part that's at the bottom, the lighter gray part, as its own H2 that may or may not be visible on the screen, but that would need to be integrated so that we create that hierarchy between the different sections that are basically sitting at the same level on the document, which is what we ended up doing in the ultimate version. Ultimately, I mean in the design, where we've integrated different levels so that levels of headings, so that it would represent that structure in the most reliable way possible. So those are examples, again, of how these heuristics and the statements can lead design into making the right decisions for accessibility and how that can inform the process going further. So I'm going to move it over to Aparna for the last heuristic that we'll cover today about contrast and legibility.
Thank you, Denis. So the third and the final heuristic for this session is contrast and legibility. As the name of the heuristic suggests, this is more about color contrast of the font, non-text graphic, and readability or legibility of the font itself. The important aspect that we really need to keep in mind while designing interactions is if we are using color alone to convey information. Denis, can you move to the next slide, please? Yes, thank you. So the common example of using color alone is showing error state with only red color border around the form fields. Now, another scenario that comes to my mind is showing green color as success and red color as failure. In both these scenarios, a colorblind user will not be able to make sense or understand what is going on the screen because they would not be able to differentiate or distinguish between red and green color. Designers tend to use colors for very different reasons, and it is really important that we keep in mind to not use color alone to convey a state or information, and always have an additional visual cue to associate with the color so that the colorblind user or low vision user or even cognitive user would be able to understand the intent. The next important aspect that is part of this heuristic is with regards to the color contrast between the foreground and the background of the text. So without proper color contrast, a colorblind person, and again a low vision user, would not be able to differentiate the text, and the readability of the same would be very poor. It is very important to have 4.5:1 contrast ratio for text size of 12 point and 3:1 for text size of 18 point. Now, you might be wondering how to get this contrast ratio. There are tools out there that you can use where you input the hexadecimal value of the background and the foreground colors, and you would get the color contrast ratio, and it would also let you know whether it is a WCAG level A, AA, or AAA failure. So that is one tool that would come to your help when you're designing or choosing the colors or color palette for the website that you're designing. Additionally, having 1.5 m or rem spacing between two lines of text is needed to let cognitive and low vision users be able to read the content without any trouble. In fact, all these factors provide a great user experience for normal sighted users as well. So the other important aspect that we really need to keep in mind is the usage of images of text. Now, designers tend to have the aesthetic reasons of using images of text, where they would like to style the text in using a particular font or color, or the the kind of the shadow effect, or all the other aesthetic feeling that the text should have. But for a low vision user or a cognitive user, they tend to change the style or font color or zoom the text, or they tend to do many more things which they will not be able to do with a image of text. So wherever possible, it is very important to keep in mind that we use the real text and not the images of text. When we use the image of text, the user experience for low vision user and cognitive users would be really poor, and it is really troublesome when you actually see the users do that. So this is more about these statements covering the contrast and legibility heuristic. Now we will see through two examples that we have for this heuristic. So the first one is about, if you see the left side image, try the beginner's guide, that is the blue color font on white background. So that is not very clear for a low vision user or a colorblind user. But when you take the example onto the right, the black on white is very clear. It would pass the color contrast ratio of 4.5:1 with like way more, and it is more legible, it is more readable to any user. So when you choose colors, ensure that it is just not 4.5, but you're actually meeting more than that, and you're enhancing the background or the foreground colors in a way that they complement each other and give a greater user experience. Again, for the smaller text, it should be 4.5:1. And for large text, which is 18 point, it should be 3:1. And also having that 1.5 em spacing in between the paragraphs would give more readability to the users. And the other point that would come under this heuristic is to have non-textual graphic color contrast. So when we talk about icons, we tend to use colors that go with the theme, or we really kind of not focus more on the colors. But having the color contrast ratio for the non-text graphics is also important. And if you see from the standards point, WCAG 2.1 would definitely ask you to have 3:1 color contrast ratio. So ensure that even the contrast, the icons meet the color contrast of 3:1, so that it is clear for users who would know, the low vision users or the colorblind users, to understand the intent of the icon. Again, the important statement that we need to ask ourselves is if the foreground and background contrast ratio for the meaningful graphics, not the decorative, but meaningful graphics, is at least 3:1. So this concludes our demonstration on the heuristic part. Now, for closing, I would pass it on to Denis.
Thank you, Aparna. So a couple of questions, so we're going to get to those in a minute. Before we do so, I just wanted to, well, first of all, thank everyone on behalf of Laura, Aparna, and myself for showing up today and being a part of this. I wanted to make sure that you all get a sense of what is coming up. So if you've enjoyed what we've been showing today, there is more of that coming up on the 20th of November, and then also on the 6th of December will be where we will finish all other 7 heuristics for the content. So we already have a page set up for the next one. If you want to register to that, you have the URL over there, and of course, as we share the document, you'll be able to see that. But also, if you just go to dq.com on the news and resources menu item of our navigation, you'll find webinars, and you'll find it there also. So with that said, I'm going to turn over for questions. So I think, should I end it over to you, Laura, so for to end up the questions?
Yeah, sure. I have one in our Q&A chat that I'll go ahead and start with. Jessica asks, when you have a section with learn more links, how do you differentiate them for screen readers? Do you use an ARIA label or ARIA described by related to the text prior to the button, or are there other ways?
There are a couple of ways to do that, for sure. I mean, of course, we don't want to stop using content like learn more or more info or read more when it comes to particular types of links, because they serve a very precise purpose in our design. But as you're implying, those links out of context, they won't mean much to a screen reader user, especially if they're extracting the entire list of links into say NVDA or JAWS to get the full list of links in a modal, for instance. So ways to do that. The way that we recommend the most these days, I would say, is the use of ARIA label. So you basically, if you want to have a more contextualized link, then just read more, you could use ARIA label to have a value that says something like read more about this webinar series, for instance. So visually you would have read more, but what the screen reader would pick up is read more about this webinar series or something like that. When you use ARIA label, of course, you have to keep in mind that it's going to completely replace the actual text. So you don't want to use ARIA label to create or provide complementary information. You need to remember that it replaces everything entirely. That's one way to do that. You could also use ARIA described by, I guess, if you wanted to refer to something else on the page that could be added on top of what you have in your link to sort of combine them into a bigger, more meaningful link text. That would work too. I mean, it always depends on just how much ARIA is supported the user agents that you're using in these technologies. Another way would be, which is more old school and which I personally tend to prefer a little bit, is to have the entire link as part of the anchor itself or as part of the button. So for instance, read more about the webinar series, but then use CSS to hide part of that off screen, or just turn that into a one-by-one clip so that nobody sees it, but it's still there as part of the link. So when you disable CSS, for instance, the entire link is there. When you extract, it's automatically part of the link also. But that requires a little bit more CSS than just using some ARIA would. If there's one thing you really should not consider doing is using a title attribute, because it's just not supported in a very reliable way. So while it will work for some, it will not work for others. And if you're trying to go beyond the idea of just being compliant to standard, but really provide the most accessible experience possible to the broadest range of users, title is really not your best friend. So that would be my answer to that one.
Great, thanks, Denis. Mark says, fantastic job developing the accessibility heuristics model and evaluation process. Do you have any insight on how to coach designers for evaluating heuristic statements that are subjective in nature? For example, easy to read, clearly defined, and facilitate wayfinding.
Well, when we train, I've sort of made it a purpose of mine to never really talk about WCAG to designers in the first place. It's already an uncomfortable conversation with developers and QA people to begin with, because of all the different success criteria and all the different numbers that they feel they have to remember to do those things. So that's how we came up with the idea of the heuristics initially. The heuristics all pretty much map to the guidelines of WCAG to a certain degree. So it's a different way to present the same information, but in a way that hopefully makes more sense because it speaks their language a little more, so the language of designers. So to us, really, the way to coach designers on those heuristic statements is really to get them to think about the end goal, which is to provide, for instance, a clear way to navigate and find your way around content. So understand what that intent is and have that in their heads as they're designing content, and hoping that over time it triggers a couple of flags or red flags here and there when they're seeing that, oh, maybe they should have added a breadcrumb to that page, or maybe the search box wouldn't be such a bad idea after all, right? Like, so it's really getting them to, I mean, by raising awareness basically about the differences, because this works hand in hand with using personas and different lenses for disabilities on top of those personas, and thinking about the whole designing for the extremes that we've mentioned before also, and how designing for people that are on the trailing ends of that bell curve makes it so that your average users are going to be handled or their needs are going to be handled implicitly. So it's teaching those concepts to the designers so that when they start looking at their design, they naturally start to think about users that are usually outside of their scope, and that's how it gets built, really. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question specifically, but it's about the mindset for the most part, and those 10 heuristics are there to help the designer get on that journey of thinking in a more inclusive manner when they design.
Great, thanks, Denis. Lorraine asks, how can we watch the past webinars? Lorraine, if you go to the news and resource and webinars navigation items on our website, you'll see at the bottom of that there are on-demand webinars that you can watch for free. So next question for you, Denis. Can you please relate again on how to design error messages? They're usually marked in red with some instructions. What is the best practice for those? Thanks.
Well, the convention definitely is to have errors written in red as opposed to black. So the first thing that comes to mind, obviously, is you want to make sure that you're not going to use a red that would not meet sufficient contrast ratios from both against the surrounding text, if it's part of the same object, and also against the background. Oftentimes people don't really think about it too much, so they want red text, so they're going to use just like the regular FF0000 or F00 Xcode value, which gives that like really bright red. It so happens that red against white doesn't meet contrast ratio, so we see that often. where it needs to be a little darker, so it needs at least at 4.5 ratio. So that's the first thing, really. But in terms of designing error messages, there are a couple of things I think that are important. The first one is that you should never just have that error message in text. It should always be supported by some visual that will also help draw attention to it. Because it's one thing to have an error message that is conveyed properly to a screen reader user, but for a sighted user who may not have a full view of the entire screen because they're using magnification, or because they may just not be focused on the right area right now, they may still miss that error message if it's not supported by something else. So we see little icons like a exclamation mark or something like that.
Warning icon, yeah.
A warning icon, something like that, exactly. Or it may be that the error message itself is boxed, so it stands out. So I think those elements definitely helps. I would say, and again, a lot of what I'm talking about is not so much what WCAG requires, but really what works best for people in general, thinking of all different types of disabilities together, but using inline error messaging as opposed to just having the errors at the very top of your form is also going to be useful, because yes, you could have all those errors at the top in kind of a bucket list, but again, if I have low vision and I'm zoomed in on only a portion of the page at once, I may get to the error, the field that has an error, but I no longer see the errors at the top. So if they're both at the top and repeated in line with with the field, that's always better. So that's another thing to consider. And then maybe
Add to
also,
that,
yeah, go
I
ahead.
think, yeah, I think it is important to have those inline error messages visible all the time, because we tend to see that when you tab out of the field, the error message disappears, and we are not sure if that field in the error state is fixed or not. So until the error is fixed, if we can have the error message displayed at all times, I think it really helps the low vision and the cognitive users.
Yeah, absolutely. And the last thing I wanted to say about that also was that if you're going to use error messaging like that, you want those error messages to also be conveyed to assistive technologies. And that's where you would use ARIA Describe By, for instance, to connect the actual form field with the error message, so that when you set focus to the form field, it not only conveys the actual text label of that form element, but also that error message. So both get sort of concatenated into one string that gets conveyed to the assistive technology user.
Great. Here's a question from Anne. She said that on their WordPress website, there's a drop-down menu that's not accessible, and this seems to be a common issue, as readers cannot identify sub-menu items under the main menu headers. This may be a developer question. I'm not sure if this relates to design, but do you have any ideas for how to redesign the drop-down menu so that it could be accessible?
Can you explain how it's like again? Because I'm not sure that I understood. I can vision it in my head.
So the issue is that the drop-down menu on WordPress themes are commonly inaccessible, in that the readers cannot identify sub-menu items under the main menu headers.
Yeah, this is the common issue that we see, that the main menu having sub-menu is not being exposed.
Mm-hmm.
Because the drop-downs are using opt-grouped elements, or because it's just visually presented with an indentation that doesn't convey the semantics?
Could be the second one, I guess, because...
Yeah. So I'm going to try something, but if the description of the issue here is that visually there is a little bit of indentation, so there's more white space before the actual word, so that creates an indentation in the drop-down, then semantically there's nothing conveyed about the structure. It's only visual in terms of structure. So obviously this is not going to help anyone who can't see the actual drop-down. So opt group is meant for exactly that, to create sections inside a drop-down menu. I just don't know how reliably opt group is being supported in assistive technologies in general. But that would be the first thing to look at. Other than that, it's probably working. If the only thing that you have as an option is to work with the visual presentation, it would need to provide indications that allow the user to understand that through that visual presentation, we just shifted to a different level hierarchically. And you could hide that stuff with CSS also, much in the same way that you could hide extra content from a link or button through CSS. So it's not something that every sighted user actually gets to see, but you would need something like that to convey the structure, if this is really what we're talking about.
Okay, great, thanks. And looks like we have time for probably one more. The question is, what about, for color contrast, what about fonts that are in disclosures of footer areas which are less than 12? Should the contrast be higher for those smaller font sizes?
You want to pick that one, Aparna? Want to start with that
Yeah,
one?
they should be at least minimum 4.5:1. But higher the contrast, it's better because the font size is much smaller. So we definitely suggest to have more than 4.5:1.
Yeah. What I would add to that basically is that color contrast applies to, because I've also seen a question about disabled content, so I'm going to loop that in at the same time. The success criterion for color contrast at 1.4.3 has a couple of exceptions at the beginning. One of those exceptions is about content that is, I forget what they're calling it, but it basically means disabled content. So color contrast does not apply to that in particular. But for actual text, and especially text that conveys information, which would be information that you find in the footer, that absolutely needs to meet the contrast ratios. So 4.5 would be the minimum, which means that light gray on a white background doesn't work. It needs to be a certain level of gray for it to pass. But Aparna is right. If the smaller the text, the more difficult it is to perceive it. So ideally you would have more than 4.5, but what is required is 4.5. What you also want to make sure is that if you have text that is smaller than, say, 12 points or 12 pixels or the equivalent, that we will be able to at least bump up that font size, so you don't have anything in your code that may prevent us from zooming in on that font size, which doesn't happen really in a browser these days, but oftentimes we see on mobile that pinch to zoom is disabled, so you can't zoom in, and if text is really too small, and it's also pretty light in terms of color, then of course people are going to struggle with reading that.
Great. Well, we have run out of time. I just want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar, especially to Aparna and Denis for doing such a great job presenting. Keep an eye out for the email with the recording and the slides, and please join us for part 2 of this accessibility heuristic series that we're doing on November 20th. We'll be covering the next 4 heuristics. And thanks again, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.